was, of course, the first few bars of White Christmas, and I've chosen this example because it illustrates how you can use a diminished seventh chord not as a substitute dominant seventh, as we have been doing so far in this series, but as a triple appoggiatura to either the 1 chord or the 5 chord. Now, I've talked about appoggiaturas in a previous video in this series. I'll put a link to that in the description below. So, in the key of C major, if we play a C diminished 7th chord, going to an ordinary C major chord, we get this. And we can think of this diminished 7th chord not as a substitute dominant, but basically approaching the notes of a C major chord with 3 appoggiaturas. We have a lower appoggiatura D sharp going to E, a lower appoggiatura F sharp going to G, and we have an upper appoggiatura A going down to G. Now, in jazz, generally speaking, we would keep the A there, which then becomes the 6th of C major 7. On the dominant chord, we can do the same thing. So, dominant chord in the key of C, of course, is G. If we play a G diminished 7th chord, followed by a G7, once again, we can think of the diminished 7th chord not as a substitute dominant, but approaching the notes of G7 with 3 lower appoggiaturas. We have the B is approached from A sharp, the D from C sharp, and the F, the 7th, from E. So once again, now, those 2 chords are quite commonly used. It's a different function of the diminished 7th to the one that we've been talking about so far in this series. Just to recap on that, we've been talking about the the diminished 7th chord used as a passing chord on non-chord notes in what Barry Harris called the major 6th diminished 7th scale. So the major 6th diminished 7th scale in C is just a C major scale with 1 added note in between G and A, G sharp. And we call the chord notes, we count C, the root, the 3rd, E, G, the 5th, and A, the 6th. And we harmonise the chord notes with major 6 chords, and the notes in between with diminished 7th chords, and that produces this. Now, when we're using the diminished 7th like that, it's functioning basically as a dominant 7th with a flattened 9th and without the root. In other words, if I put a root G down at the bottom on the diminished 7th chord, we've got G7 flat 9. So that's probably the most common use of a diminished 7th chord. In this lesson, though, I'm talking about this other use, which is mainly on the chord 1 and on the chord 5, where we play a diminished 7th chord based on that root, and then it resolves onto that chord. And it creates tension, which is then resolved. And it also creates inner movement. And really, that's the main thing about the Barry Harris harmonic method, that he explored lots of different ways of finding inner movement within a chord. It's used quite often, for instance, at the beginning of the song Misty. It goes down to an E flat major 7 chord. But often people play E flat diminished chord for, and it just creates that tension which is then resolved. So let's look now at what I did on White Christmas. On the first melody note, E, I played what Barry Harris would have called the 6th on the 5th. I played a G major 6 chord with C in the bass, and what that gives you is a C major 9 chord. It then changed to a C6 chord, which created inner movement under a long melody note. So the major 9th went to the root, and at the same time the major 7th to the 6th, they move in thirds, and that's a typical Barry Harris movement. I've talked about that movement in a previous video in this series. I'll put a link in the description below. I then went on to this chord, a diminished 7th, going to a C6 chord. Now in this case, that diminished 7th chord simply comes from the Barry Harris major 6th diminished 7th scale, which then goes to C6, and it functions as a dominant 7th, a G7, but without the root. If I put the G in, then we've just got a 5-1 chord progression. The next chord though, this diminished 7th, is the one that really is the subject of this lesson, and this is the one that doesn't function as a substitute dominant 7th chord. It's like approaching a C chord, but with 3 appoggiaturas. Now, if this was classical music, it would probably resolve like that, without the 6th, just a C triad there, and you would think of it as a lower appoggiatura D sharp to E, lower appoggiatura F sharp to G, and the A in the diminished 7th chord would be an upper appoggiatura, so it would also go to G. Because it's jazz, we tend to keep the A where it is, which then just makes it a C6 chord. I then went on to a D minor 7 chord, and then I changed to another diminished 7th chord. Now that is a common movement on a D minor 7 chord. The 3rd and the root rise a semitone, which gives you a diminished 7th chord, and this one functions as a dominant 7th, a D7 without the root, going to G, or G7. If I put the root in there, you've just got a secondary dominant D7 going to G7. I then played an F6 chord. Now on the B, I played another diminished 7th chord. Now this one really is another example of the diminished 7th as a triple appoggiatura. The B is approaching the C, the G sharp approaching the A, and again, if it was classical music, the D would go down a step to the C, but because it's jazz, we keep it where it is, and it just becomes the 6th of F6. And then just went to a G7 chord with a 13th, E, flat 9th. Back to the 6th on the 5th. And then you can put 2 chromatic passing notes there. Keep them where they are, make a G suspended chord, which resolves, and the 9th goes to the flat 9th. And then back to the 6th on the 5th. That's not the only way, of course, of harmonising White Christmas. A lot of people would prefer this one. playing A7 there to D minor 7. That works really well because the melody note becomes the flattened fifth of A7. Gives you that nice colour. And then a lot of people also play a kind of parallel harmony thing where they're just playing open voicing for C major 7 like that, and everything just moves up and down in steps. That works as well. So there's never just one right answer. Hope you found that useful. If you did and you haven't done so far, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And I always welcome your comments below. Thank you. See you in the next video.